Chapter 4. The allotment golfers had come to something of a critical stage in their game. They had, by now, reached the 18th green, and OMalley had but to sink a 9-foot putt across Reg Watling's furrowed spinach patch to take the match. Betting had been growing steadily during the morning's play, and with each increase in financial risk, the two men had grown ever more tight-lipped, eagle-eyed, and alert to the slightest infringement of the rules. OMalley spat on his palms and rubbed them together. He stalked slowly about his ball and viewed it from a multiplicity of angles. He scrutinised the lie of the land, tossed a few straws in the air and nodded thoughtfully as they drifted to earth. He licked his finger and held it skyward. He threw himself to the ground and squinted along his putter, sniper fashion. "Right then," said the broth of a boy. "It looks like child's play." Pooley, who was employing what he referred to as the psychology, shook his head slowly. "That would be at least a free to the sinking, I would believe." OMalley gestured over his shoulder to the water butt wherein lay Pooley's ball. "You would be phoning for Jack Rousseau and his lads, I shouldn't wonder." Pooley shrugged. "That is an easy shot compared to this." OMalley sniggered. "Keep your eye on the ball, Jim," he advised. OMalley's putting technique bore an uncanny resemblance to that practised by a seasoned Yorkshire batsman at the Oval. The putter had a tendency to dig well on such occasions, sometimes to a depth of some 3 inches or more, and once beyond digging range. There was generally a fair amount of lift on the ball, although the now official Handbook of Allotment Golf suggested that any balls putted above shoulder height should be considered as drives and the player penalised accordingly. OMalley squared up his ball whilst Pooley continued to employ the psychology. He coughed repeatedly, rustled sweet papers in his pocket, and scuffed his black-eyed heels in the dust. "Is that a lurcher or a dane?" he asked, pointing towards some canine of his own creation. OMalley ignored him. There was big beer money on this shot. John suddenly swung the putter in a blurry arc and struck deeply behind his ball, raising a great clod of earth, which is referred to in golfing circles as a divot. The ball cannonaded across the allotment with a whine like a doctored tom, struck a section of corrugated iron fencing, bowled along old Pete's herbaceous border, and skidded to a halt a mere inch from the 18th hole. OMalley swore briefly, but to the point, flung down his putter and turned his back on the wanton pill. "Bad luck," said Pooley, amid ill-concealed titters. By way of consolation, he added, "It was a brave try, but would you prefer that I pause for a moment before sinking my ball on the off chance that an earth tremor might secure you the match?" OMalley kicked his golf bag over. "Steady on," said Pooley. John turned upon him bitterly. "Go on then, Jimmy boy," he sneered. "Let's see you take your shot." "You won't like it." "Won't I, though?" Pooley tapped at his nose. "Care to up the bet in a trice?" OMalley stroked his chin. "From the water butt, in one, that's what you're telling me." Pooley nodded. "Unless you, like the Dalai Lama, have mastered the techniques of levitation and telekinesis, which I do not believe, I do not rate your chances." "You will kick yourself afterwards." OMalley spat onto his palm and slapped it into that of his companion. "I'll bet 'a doubled. Will that serve you?" "Adequately." Pooley strolled over to the water butt. With the lie of the land, it certainly was in a perfect line for the hole, just down a slight slope and into the depression where lay the 18th. "I shall play it from here," said Jim, turning his back upon the target. OMalley stuck his hands into his pockets. "As you please," said he. "I will play it with a mashie if you have no objections." "None whatsoever." OMalley selected the club and handed it to his companion. Pooley leant forward and chalked a small cross at the base of the water butt. Drawing back, he grasped the club hammer-like in his right fist and, with a lewd wink, struck the ancient zinc tank a murderous blow. It was a sizable hole, and the water burst through it with great enthusiasm. Bearing down with the sudden torrent, and evidently much pleased to be free of its watery grave, Pooley's ball bobbed along prettily. It danced down the slight incline, pirouetted about the 18th hole, as if taking a final bow, then plunged into it with a sarcastic gurgle. "My game," said Pooley, rubbing his hands together. "Best we settle up now, I think." OMalley struck his companion a devastating blow to the skull. Jim collapsed into a forest of beanpoles, but rose almost immediately with a great war cry. He leapt upon OMalley, catching him round the waist and bearing him towards the now muddy ground. "Pull, loser!" he he shouted, grinding his thumb into OMalley's right eye. "Bloody damn cheat," the other replied, going as ever for the groin. The two men were more than equally matched, although OMalley was by far the dirtier fighter. They bowled over and over in the mud, bringing into play a most extraordinary diversity of unsportsmanlike punches, low kicks and back elbows. They'd been tumbling away in like fashion for some 10 minutes, doing each other the very minimum amount of damage, yet expending a great deal of energy, when each man suddenly became aware that his antics were being observed. Some 20 yards or so away, a solitary figure in a grey coverall suit stood silently watching. At the distance, it was difficult to make out his features clearly, but they seemed wide and flat and had more than a suggestion of the Orient about them. The two men rose from the ground, patting away at their claws. The fight was over, the ref's decision being a draw. They beat a hasty retreat to the doubtful safety of Pooley's allotment shed. Through a knothole in the slatted side, they squinted at the grey figure. He was as immobile as a shop window dummy, and stared towards them unblinkingly in a manner which the sensitive Jim found quite upsetting. He was of average height, with high cheekbones and a slightly tanned complexion, and bore a striking resemblance to a young Jack Palance. Pooley sought about for his tobacco tin. "I don't like the look of this," he said. OMalley, who had liberated Pooley's tin from his pocket during the fight, was rolling a cigarette behind his back. "He's probably some workman chappie," he suggested, "or possibly a bus conductor or site engineer from the gasworks." The hollow tone in OMalley's voice was not lost upon his companion. "He has more of the look of a municipal worker to me," said Jim, shaking his head dismally. "A park-keeper, perhaps. Oh, don't say it," said John. "Some spy from the council come to inspect the allotment." Pooley clenched his fists. "This is all too much. Discriminated against and ostracised from the council courses. Now tracked down here for further discrimination and ostracism, handed down because of our love of the game. It's all too much to bear. Let us kill him now and bury his body." OMalley agreed that it was all too much to bear, but thought Pooley's solution a little drastic. "All may not be lost," he said. "He may have only just arrived and might only have witnessed our slight disagreement regarding the excellence of your trick shot. He may not suspect the cause." Pooley gestured through a broken window pane to where his golf caddy, a converted supermarket trolley, stood bristling with its assortment of unmatched clubs. OMalley hung his head. "The game's up," said he in a leaden tone. Pooley put his eye once more to the knothole. "He's still there. Perhaps we could reason with him, or better still, offer a bribe." OMalley thought this sound enough, every man having his price. "How much do you have in your pockets?" he asked. Pooley smiled grimly. "We have not yet settled up over the game. I think that it is for you to approach him, John. Employ your silken tongue, and feel free to invest a portion of my winnings if needs be. You can always owe me the difference. I consider you to be a man of honour." OMalley licked the end of his captured roll-up. "All right," he said nobly. "I shall go. We shall consider your winnings to be an investment to secure a further season of uninterrupted play. During this period, I have not in the least doubt that if your game continues at its present standard, you'll have the opportunity to lighten my pockets continually." Pooley opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it. In such matters, OMalley generally held the verbal edge. "Go then, with my blessings," he said, "but kindly leave me my tobacco tin." OMalley straightened up his regimental necktie, squared his broad and padded shoulders, threw open the hut door and stepped out into the sunlight. The figure lurking amongst the beanpoles watched the Irishman with an inscrutable expression. OMalley thrust his hands into his trouser pockets and gazed about the allotment with extreme nonchalance. He yawned, stretched, and then, as if seeing the figure for the first time, flicked at his mop of curly black hair and bid the stranger a hearty "Good morning there." The figure uttered not a word, but merely stared on regardless. "There'll be rain before the evening, I shouldn't wonder," said OMalley, who was rarely rattled. "Won't do the ground any harm, though." As he spoke, he slowly strolled in the stranger's direction, covering his approach with the occasional sidestep to scrutinise some flowering bloom, but soon there was less than 15 yards between them. "Should get a rare old crop of beans up this year," said John, stepping nimbly over old Pete's watering can. In order that he might reach the council's spy, for by this time OMalley felt 100% certain that this was in fact the lurker's despicable calling, it was necessary for him to pass behind Soap Distant's heavily bolted corrugated iron shed. Soap himself had vanished away from Brentford under most extraordinary circumstances, but his rental upon the shed was paid up until the turn of the following century, and his hut remained untouched and inviolate. O'Malley sneaked away behind it. He lost sight of the spy for but a moment, but when he emerged at the spot where the malcontent should have been standing, to John's amazement, not a soul was to be seen. Pooley came ambling up. "Where did he go?" he asked. "I took my eyes off him for a moment, and he was gone." O'Malley shook his head. "There's something not altogether kosher about this, I'm thinking." "He must have legged it, had it away on his toes." O'Malley scratched at the stubble on his chin. "Perhaps," said he, "perhaps. There's a terrible smell of creosote hereabouts. Has anybody been pasting his palings?" "Not to my knowledge." O'Malley shrugged. "Shall we play another round, then?" Pooley scrutinised his Piaget wristwatch. "I feel a little unsettled," he said. "Perhaps we should adjourn now to the Swan for a cooling pint of large to ease our fractured nerves." "Dad," said O'Malley, smacking his hands together, "it's not a bad idea, by any reckoning."